Շնորհակալ եմ, որ եկել եք մեր ճարտարապետական հանդիպումների կարծեմ 4-րդ հանդիպումն է սա, այս շրջանում։ Ուրեմն, ինչպես ամեն երկու շաբաթ մեկ, մենք հյուրեր, որոնք պատմեն իրենց գործունեության մասին ու նաև ընդհանուր առմամբ հետաքրքիր թեմաների մասին խոսեն, ճարտարապետության ու քաղաքաշինության մասին։ Այս շաբաթվա մեր հյուրերն են պարոն Levine և Heidi Dumreicher։ Իրենք ներկայացնում են Միացյալ Նահանգները, պարոն Levine Sustainable ճարտարապետության, ինքնաբավ ճարտարապետության ու քաղաքաշինության պիոներներից է եղել և մինչև օրս առաջադահներից, հույսում եմ վստահ շատ հետաքրքիր կլինի իրենց թեման, որը ապագայի ինքնաբավ քաղաքների մասին է լինելու։ Պիտի նաև շնորհակալություն հայտնեմ Ուտոպիանային, որ նաև սա մի մասն է կազմում են իրենց Spaces ծրագրի, նաև կարծում եմ Նորան մի երկու բառ դրա մասին կասի, եթե
ուղղակի ավելացնեմ, որ այս հանդիպումը վերջին մեր հանդիպումն ավելի մեծ նախագծի, որը կոչվում է հանրային զրույցներ և անդրադառնում է հանրային տարածքների խնդրին հետխորհրդային երկրներում։ Նախագծի իրականացումը համագործակցային նախագիծ է և իրականացումը հետխորհրդային մի քանի երկրների հետ, Վրաստան, Մոլդովա, Ուկրաինա։ Եվ սա փաստորեն փորի ընթացքում այսպես քարավան միջոցառումներ է լինում մի երկրից մյուսը և մենք փաստորեն հյուրընկալում ենք երկրորդ քարավանը, առաջինը Թիֆլիսում էր։ Եթե մասնակցել եք լավ, եթե չէ, ավելի մանրամասն ինֆորմացիա կա կայքի վրա։ Ամեն դեպքում այսօր վերջին ելույթը կլինի, ինչպես արդեն Սևադան ներկայացրեց, Levine և Heidi Dumreicher-ի ներկայացումը կան ճարտարապետության կամ ինքնաբավ ճարտարապետության մասին։
At the end of a week of Spaces, which was led by our two partners and hosts here, who sit in the first row, which was an introduction to the context. There was a lot of discussion about how much the context counts. And somehow we were talking about public space, not somehow, we were talking about public space. And this is in a tradition, I think a worldwide tradition, that public space and urban structure in general is a manifestation place for public power and for authorities. Maybe it gets more visible here because the time goes on so quickly with different symbols of government and authorities being destroyed and others coming up. So here we have a condensed lesson of it. But it is a European and probably worldwide phenomenon. We have, of course, the public memory present in the physical kind of public space, especially. And here it gets under, from what we understand from these many meetings that our hosts have been organizing, we understand that the pressure on public space is especially stringent here. On the one hand, you have the political and including the national ideology that makes pressure on the spaces. But on the other hand, the theoretical basis of our whole project was also that there's a double pressure. On the one hand, what I just said, and on the other, also of the capitalistic forces. So we see these two very powerful elements putting pressure on the public space. And then I see several of representatives of the third force, which is the social society, the civil society, the activists. We just come out of a long discussion about the role of these activists, and in our case also including arts and artists. So there's a claim of ownership of public space from these three very different, let's say, societal groups. But what we want to do now is to present a different view that for you will be related, we hope, to the situation also here in Tbilisi, but that comes out from long-term studies. My colleague Bettina Kolb, who is the co-author of the social part, will be coming, so she's here, and Levine, who was the partner on urbanistic ideas and on sustainability of urban contexts over many years. So, would you like to make an introductory?
Well, yes, it's a great pleasure to be here. What you'll experience tonight is a collaboration over 4,000 miles, and because Heidi represents the social perspective, and I represent, let's say, the scientific, architectural, urbanistic perspective, there's bound to be a lot of tension between us. But without the tension, you fall asleep. So maybe we can maintain the tension, at the same time find some kind of agreement. I have to say that one of the things that I have experienced being here for just a few days is a lot of very productive tension that has the possibility to go ahead. And I say this from the perspective of an American, someone from the United States, where our trajectory is we're up here, you're down here. In the sense that, and it's not good being up here, because we have already established a downward trajectory. And you're here, but you've established an upward trajectory. I'm much more optimistic about you and your upward trajectory than we of our downward trajectory. So it's really invigorating to come from a country that has become more and more ungovernable for the wrong reasons, than to be here in a country that has all sorts of problems, but the problems are generating a lot of very positive energies. And the discussions that we've been having relate to how positive energies themselves create a space, whether it's a real space, a three-dimensional space, or a virtual space, an intellectual space. And they're both here, and they're both very invigorating.
So we go to our first slide, which is 7 things later. No, we don't do this one.
Okay.
One of the
things that we had an encounter about was that our presentation was too long. And so we skipped the whole first part, which is very interesting. It's a pity you had to miss it. But we go directly to the second part. Heidi?
Yeah. Towns are diverse, so Dick kindly agreed to follow theories that Bettina and myself have worked out with our sociological methods. And we have tested them in Europe, in Vienna, in China, in villages and towns, and in the Arab Spring countries. And we found, and that is also one of the basic ideas, that there are commonalities in the views. Locally speaking, there will be big differences, but we find issues that concern the social structure and the social fabric of the town to be quite similar, and we have not yet added what we are studying now, which is the context here in Tbilisi and in Yerevan, which are the two places that we saw, and Kiev and Chisinau, which we are going to see, but this is not yet included in the study. This is an ongoing study now. So we see that the city, in its complexity, has a lot of dichotomies, a lot of things that need to happen in this complex system at the same time, or that happen at the same time, and also that the dwellers, our view is the view of the dwellers, but the basis for this series is the dwellers' view. And we can find that a town quality consists in somehow combining both of those qualities, like a human scale, where the relationship, the social relationships are visible, versus anonymity, which guarantees the individual freedom, let's say. But, so it's also this freedom, this individual freedom, which can go into a loss of control. So these are also two dichotomies that need to somehow merge. And also that if we are living in our towns, we want at the same time what we have called the scale of a village. So we would like to have an environment where people know our names, where we know their names, their faces, which is a link to the village tradition. But on the other end of the scale, a town is also an urban space, urbanity, which goes far beyond the village characteristics, and creates this very big contradictory urbanity which wants to find ways of dealing with both of these aspects, the narrowness and the farness, the village and the urban big spectrum. And of course, a lot of our humanitarian thoughts and of European thinking has started in an urban context. So these two things are always influencing each other. The village idea, linkage to earth and all that, and also the urbanity, which is more future-oriented also. So these two are present in an urban situation.
Through history, cities have started with grids. And a grid is a condition where everything is possible. But if nothing happens, nothing happens. Unless the grid is differentiated with special events, the city has no identity. One of the great things about Yerevan is that it has placeness at many different scales. The famous circular plan superimposed on the grid, superimposed on diagonals, is very rich in places automatically at a number of different scales. And the response over time to the different potentials in different places gives rise to the richness of a city. Of course, it's then a question of how well the populace, or let's say the decision makers, respond to those opportunities. And I'm not qualified yet, I haven't been here long enough to say what I think about it. But I see in the basic plan and in the places that I've seen that there are so many interesting conditions, the mountains and the response to the mountains, the river, and the man-made structures that have inserted themselves in this natural topography to realize that there are a lot more possibilities in Yerevan than there are in many other cities.
This is about urban services. In Eurotalk, in European terms, this could now be called governance. It's a new term that has come up in the last 2 or 3 years in the discussion about sustainability of a town, which is the relationship between the administration, the authorities, and the dwellers, the residents. And this is a lot about services, who provides which service. On the one hand, where do the services come from, and on the other hand, how the dwellers actually get the fruit of these services. And it's obvious that, or not obvious, we can see here how also the quest and the fight for basic urban services is still going on. I just read an article in Financial Times that one of the greatest innovations in modern times, from the 15th century to now, is not computers and all that. It's really taking water to every house and taking out the sewage of every house. To that comment, this was the greatest innovation ever and changed much more than any other inventions that we think of as being so important. But taking the water to the place and taking the shit out of it, these are in fact innovative things that influence all our urban life and our private lives. So this can really be considered one of the big innovations, let's say, of European, maybe American civilization. Is this, I mean, it sounds ridiculous, but I think there's a lot of truth to this. So this is proximity supply, public utilities and so on. And if Dick and myself we speak about the sustainable city, it also means to reconceptualize, to rethink what this service is. When we were organizing events in public space in Vienna, we would realize that me, the dweller, me, the artist, me, the civil society organization who wants to do something in town, I'm considered a beggar from the point of view of the administration. I need to make my case very well, I need to be very well prepared to tell what I need, and then they kindly agree to give me what I may have asked for. And we had a lot of these discussions about electricity in public space and so on. And we were always put in the position of the poor ones who want something from the established town. But in fact, the town is there also to provide these services and to give us an active role and to say, yes, we are here to serve you if you want to do things in public space. So this shift that is much more stringent here, as I can see and experience, but it is also there in the Western countries. This idea that the citizen has to conform to the needs of the town. No, the town has to conform to the needs of the resident, which is also, in a way, Natasha's topic, of course.
And I come from a country where we're having an election in a few weeks with two very polarized sides. One side says that the country, the city should provide services to the people living there, even to the poorest people. The other side says that we are individuals. If you're poor, it's your own fault. So get up and start working, and the government has only one responsibility, which is to defend our country, even if it has to attack other countries. And I don't know which way this election will turn out. It's very close. But this is a trajectory that is very dangerous. Because if I'm very wealthy, which I'm not, my money can pay for what I need. At least that's the theory. But what these people somehow don't realize is all of the things that their society, their culture, their industry, and their government is there to give them. The question is really more how to make the government more responsive, and not whether there should be a government in the first place, but also it becomes a design question. And we'll discuss this a little bit more later. On the left, we have people talking about participatory democracy. But that is, the people should decide, the people should be empowered. But I heard a story, I don't know if it's true, that when you have three Armenians together arguing about something, there are 4 different opinions. So the danger, the risk in participation is that when you empower everyone equally, there'll be lots of conflict, lots of fighting, and nothing will happen. And in fact, it becomes a threat to the regime, whatever the regime or however or open the regime is. So there's always the question, how much access do you give and to whom to the decision-making process? And that's a very important question because elective democracy, for years, all the countries in the world have been getting closer and closer to elective democracy. But now we're discovering that in a complex modern world, elective democracy is too blunt an instrument. It's too crude to do any sort of planning, to do any sort of design. It can respond to emergencies, it can respond to particular things, but to come up with a kind of plan that generated modern Yerevan, you can't do it by sitting in a room and arguing about it. You need another process.
So this is one of the theories that Bettina and myself have developed, and which is, I think, basic and also something that leads often to discussions, but also to common understanding. which is the theory about emotional co-ownership. That is, we own the city, I own the city, but in co-ownership. It's about collaborative ownership. It's about the opposite also. It's not that I use the town, it's my property. It's not about using the town, it's about co-ownership. I'm also having a stake here in terms of a co-owned town, and this ownership is emotional. Maybe I also own a little land, or maybe a group of civil society activists manages to own a park for a while, like in Occupy Wall Street in New York, for instance. For a while they were actually owning it also sort of physically and living there. And this is something that happens in civil society movements for a time. So it's really claiming the ownership of the town. But it is more about this emotional ownership. It's my town, I consider it my town, and in that way I will also take part into the presence and the future of the town. And also we now say usage creates meaning. That is, when I go in town, when I go on public spaces, when I do arts events in public space, I create, or we create, meaning in this town. It's by using and by exerting my usage and by exerting my right of co-ownership, this is what makes meaning in the town in a more general sense. And of course it's the amenities of public space, so public space is an ongoing project in our research. And this may lead to an identifying with the place. Once I have been active in the place, it gets a new meaning for me, for my group, for my family, for my internship, for my party, for different ways. The we can be many different things, and it's always a question to ask who do you mean when you say we. I'm very reluctant to let someone say we unless I know what is actually meant with this we who may use it. And also it gets, and that was also something that happened in spaces, from the abstraction that our theoretical concept offers, and that on which we are continuously working as a whole group in a collaborative way of also creating elements for the Spaces project. But at the same time, the abstraction of those concepts become reality and can become parts of this emotional co-ownership, which is also an activating factor in the city. Because if this is my co-ownership, then I have a stake here and I will be also motivated to take part in the discussion, in the debates, but also in actions.
In the weak town, in the authoritarian town, it's always they who makes the decisions. They did this for better or worse, and it's always they. So the process that leads to sustainability is where they becomes we. We know that we have access to the decision-making process, even if our own ideas, even if what we want is not adopted. We know that we have to put our ideas on the table, and that even if we have a great idea, there may be other conditions that would prevent it from being adopted that we haven't realized. But at least if the process is open, if it's transparent and we can see how it works, it's we. We have contributed to the critique of what's going on, to changing or having the potential to change the trajectory of our town.
But also we have contributed to its future. Okay, the city as a stage, or maybe we could say the city as an arena. This is visible also in Yerevan, that the town is a place for self-representation, for group representation. So, especially in movements that claim the ownership of the space. The action and the self-representation is one possible tool in this process. So the self-representation can go from the individual self-representation to be seen and to see, which is certainly not a new concept, but which fits also into today's discussion. And it's also a place for common presentations and also for conflicts. And for, as we have here, the conflicts of the last years actually show that the town is an arena and the public space is an arena. And not just for La Dérive, which was the topic at the turn of the last century, but it's also a very active element in the quest for social change and for social change or for political change. And in the West, in Western Europe, I think maybe at the same or at a similar level like here, you get this pressure on the one hand to go back. We don't know that the expression tyranny of intimacy is maybe not directly understandable, but it means that dwellers retreat into intimacy. So they give up to be present in the town, and they rather prefer to go to their small groups, to their families, maybe also to their intellectual surroundings, instead of of going into a more public sphere. This is what our hosts here were doing a lot with this idea of public talks. So get out of the intimacy, get into the public talks, and see what happens if you go public with your ideas and with your concepts. And on the other hand, as we can see from all the theoretical work of our partners, there is this over-commercialization which is present in all our partner countries, and obviously is a very big threat. And in the combination between oligarchy, political pressure, and commerce, it is really quite a heavy load that is concerning the development of the town, and especially the sustainability of the town.
A few nights ago, after seeing a lot of very interesting student films taken at Swan Lake, we walked over to the public square, and we saw this amazing spectacle of music, very strong, inspirational music, and lights and fountains, and our cinematographer Tatya was filming some of this. And so we were gathered around her, and we felt that her actually doing something in the space empowered us to do something. And we started at first to dance. I'm a terrible dancer. And we went kind of crazy, just dancing around to the sound of the music and the fountains going up, and maybe because the whole thing seemed a little silly, but the space that we were in, which is a very formal space, but the silliness of the lights and the water in the formal space somehow empowered us to do something that none of us could have done as individuals or even as a couple. And we got into it very slowly, and then we had a great time. People looked at us as being rather strange, but somehow the space was a place where something could happen, not just as observers, but as participants. And when people are in a public space, there are two functions. One is to look, to watch, to look at other people, to see beautiful people of the same gender, of other genders, old, young, funny-looking people, and just to watch, because there are always interesting things happen when there are people in a space together. The other is to be seen. And the ambiguity of whether you're there to look, to watch, or you're there for people to look at you, it's never clear, and so you're safe. You don't have to defend yourself in a public space when there are other people there, when it's a space that is a we space and not a they space. So I was very grateful. I think we were all very grateful that however, let's say, silly is too strong a word, but however strange the ambiance of that space was when we were there, we still felt that we had, just by the magic of both the physical surroundings and the things that were going on, we felt that we were part of Yerevan.
Maybe this is the moment also to say to whom we owe the illustrations. This was Liu Hongyi, an architect in China, at the School of Architecture in the Chinese small town, which I think is 10 million people or so, which is very small for China. So we are thankful to Liu Hongyi, who made the illustrations to our series. So you see that this is number 5. And what she saw after being with us in Chinese villages, but also after being with us in European towns. So, and we are still in contact. This is also a cooperation, friendship that started, I think, in 1999. Yes, I know when it started. So from 1999 on, we are in constant contact with Liu Hongyi and some other partners in this China project. So the near, the foreign, and the far away town. So you have some elements of nearness. The nearness is the dwelling and what is around your dwelling or your house, and also the workplace environment. There is a growing distance between, at least in Europe, between the workplace and the place where you live. So here you want nearness, or you have nearness, even if you don't want it, maybe you have too much nearness. You have also 2 different elements of being far. Sometimes far is the city center, but the relation to the city center is also present when you do not live really in the center. Like in Vienna, for instance, we were asking about what are important spaces in town, and people would always mention the opera, also, even if they never go to the opera. But it is an important, at an iconic level or at a symbolic level, the center of the town with its market, with its places, with its landmarks, is present and part of my feeling for the town. But also the suburbs. So today we went to Bangladesh, and that fit also into this idea that even if someone does never go to Bangladesh, Bangladesh is still part of the town. And we were discussing with people who went to Bangladesh today, and we were discussing with people who go there for work or for studies and so on. And it is conceived as part of the town, even if it's very far and you need an hour, even with your marshrutka, it's very far and heavy in both ways. But it is present, and also the market, I don't remember the name, which is also present, although it's a suburban situation, and yet it is also part of the town.
But over and above that, the town is a place that's walkable. The town is a place where your feet meet the pavement to go someplace. We know very well that as soon as you step in the marshrutka or in the automobile, there is a spatial discontinuity. Your vision changes, your experience changes, where your attention is changes. You don't see around you anymore. You see where you have to see if you don't want to get killed. Bangladesh, we're told, I asked why is it named Bangladesh? It's because it's far away. It might as well be in Asia. As far as being on foot is concerned.
Not only, it's also very hot there in summers. And there.
When Bangladesh got independence, that's why it's called Bangladesh. Yes.
Well, in any case,
it wasn't called because of that.
People call it.
People call it.
Like it's coincided
Bangladesh is really here.
Somewhere.
So it's a commemoration of the emergence of a new country.
So you have the specialist view who knows, and you have the dwellers view who does not know, and they together give you the real of what is happening. It's also this idea of forming narratives and myths concerning the town, which is constantly happening.
One of the things that's wrong about tall buildings is that you need an elevator to get someplace. As soon as you step into the elevator and the door is closed, you press a button with a number on it, and you've committed an architectural crime. You've created a spatial discontinuity. I mean, architects like a continuity of spaces. And you press the button, and other people there are pressing other buttons, and it goes up and it stops and it goes up and it stops. And you look to see your number come up. And that's the only relationship you have to the continuity of your walking to that place, going into the lobby, stepping in the elevator, and boom, there's no more continuity of space. It's the same thing with a vehicle. And the size of the city, the qualitative size in the city has to do much less with its physical size than with the distance you're comfortable traveling on foot. And even the fact that if you're lucky, you can travel all the places you need to travel on foot rather than in a vehicle. And in fact, you're going to discover in Yerevan the kinds of things that have been discovered in other places. The modern world creates more and more beautiful cars. And we love everyone loves automobiles and being able to step inside with our fractional horsepower bodies and step on the gas and all of a sudden get 200 or 300 horsepower at our command and go as fast as we dare until the traffic completely stops and we can't move at all. There's so many cities in the world where not only does the traffic not move, but it creates enormous pollution, you can't breathe, you're gridlocked, and the city fails, essentially. The economy goes down, the quality of life goes down, and you're on, again, a downward trajectory. So it's our feet that make the city work, and it's the city that offers us the experiences of moving through the city in a placeful city, that is a city where you like to walk in the city rather than a place where it's a chore because it's so dull, so uninteresting, or so unsafe that you really don't want to walk. So it's the city on foot that gives us the urban quality that we look for when we move towards sustainability.
6 and 7, and then we are over, and it happens to be Levine and myself always that we come up with 7 theses, and we found out in China that 6 is somehow what we think or what we know or what we think to understand, and we have a very solid basis on. So 6 is somehow a round thing where we feel safe in our knowledge, and 7 is the unknown, what we know that we do not know so well. So 7 is always a big space of new research or of new thinking, of new whatever it is. So 6 thesis is what shows a more or less secure and controlled and counter-controlled knowledge. So 6 is the city map of the mind, and this is a question that our partner Vladimir just made workshops in Chisinau about it. How can we do a mapping exercise, a different approach to the usual map of a town? The city map in the mind shows that we the dwellers have a mind map of our town where we also have both the landmarks that are important for us and make the many elements of a map of a town which is different from the geographical map. So some of it are the landmarks, maybe the sightseeing sites, if we consider ourselves tourists. These are the places that in our mind map are the ones that we want to see if you come into a new town. And it's the major foreground buildings, maybe it's the buildings that show the horizontal architecture, what I learned in a lecture a couple of days ago here in Tbilisi, but it could of course also be landmarks like Mother of Armenia or so. This is, and you have very different relationships to these landmarks. This is not saying that we like them or that we do not like them, but they are in our mind for collective memory reasons, for individual landmark reasons. Maybe I remember when I went with my father, my mother, in such and such day, or like in Kiev, there is a tradition at your marriage, you go and visit specific chosen landmark places. So they are also giving a rhythm to the town. So this is one of the elements of a town, buildings that are connected to your personal or maybe family history. But on the other hand, it's also places that do not look like fascinating or so, and who do not have a specific architectural form, which of course Dick would not like so much. But it's also places where things happen. Like a market that is not built with architectural knowledge or so, and still a market can be a place that is important for us. Or in many of these Arab towns, you have slum-like constellations, or what is the name in Turkey? You have these night neighborhoods. I will find the name for it, where people have to, when you manage to build your roof in one night, you have gained a right to stay here. So that has nothing to do with any aesthetic or so values. It has to do with places where the functionality, or also the big history, a place where many things have happened and which is not yet organized, like let's say in Beirut, for instance, places where memory of wars are staying in the place, and then it's just the memory of the place and not the place itself, or it is the place with its memory, which makes a landmark.
The underlying city grid doesn't make space. We're familiar with many cities, for example, New York City, which is a simple grid superimposed over Manhattan, but it has key points in it. One is the original city at the very south of the island. The other is Broadway, which is a diagonal that goes almost completely through the city up to 57th Street. And each time it passes a major avenue, it creates a space, a condition like this where you can't build. And so each one of those spaces is an important landmark in the city where special things happen, until it hits Columbus Circle, which is right at the corner of Central Park, which is the other major feature of the city. When you go above Central Park, the city doesn't have any important landmark features, and so it's everything above 50th or 60th Street. And those few conditions are the cardinal conditions of New York City.
I just get a remark from our partners from Tbilisi, which says "Come," and I want to thank our host here that he made a guided tour through this part of Yerevan. And it is certainly true that also this neighborhood, even for people who never go there, who have never put a foot there, and yet as it represents the history or the oldest part, or many other things too, like this mosque that is in ruins and so on, so that place too is part of the city map of the mind, and it's also an example for something that is there in the mind, but not necessarily has a complete relationship to me as a dweller in Yerevan. And it was great to follow his path through this city of the mind. We were following his city map of the mind, and he showed us his come.
When you see the plan of Yerevan, that one section is unusual. You look at the map of Yerevan, and immediately you see the places that you want to go to, that you want to look at, because they are so unique. There are many cities that don't have those conditions like that. But Yerevan is special because the map tells you so much about the city. And at the same time, you ask many questions about, I have to go here to find out what this crazy network of lines is, or what this long, funny-looking thing is going up the hill.
Yeah. So, last of the series, space is formless. You can go into the universe, which is also space, but we don't take our space labs to go. But it is shaped by objects with form, and that, of course, is the big element for the architecture, urbanists, and the physical spaces. Because, yes, space is limitless, but also, yes, the way in which the urbanists, or sometimes the dwellers themselves, are forming the city gives the space a frame and gives it the character of place in which action is possible or non-action is possible. And also the urban furnishings in the space have a form, and we saw in the students' film that we saw yesterday how big the discussion was about the benches that the town of Yerevan has put in many of the parks here. And there was that was a discussion point between the people who made the film and people who were telling about what they think about those benches. And there was a huge discussion going on whether that was a silly question or not to ask dwellers what they thought about those benches. And the specialists and experts who were commenting the film after we saw it did not find a common view on this question of a small furniture object in space. Is this important? Is this something that concerns the dwellers? And Bettina and myself, we had some come up in German with the Bänke zum Nichtsitzen. In Vienna, they were putting benches, but 4 benches around a tree, but you would only have your back towards the other people. So I would sit here, you would sit there. So it was really benches for not communication. And I had to fight, that was an article that we published in Sage Publications, which is highly renowned, and peer-reviewed and whatnot. And Bänke zum Nichtsitzen, which was an invention that, of course, does not exist. And we had to fight over many turns of peer review to let the Bänke zum Nichtsitzen be in our report. But this is really the floor for the architecture.
Last week I was in the United States in the Great Plains, where level, flat space stretches out to the horizon in all directions. And I hadn't experienced that before in many years. I looked in one direction and the sky was black and there was lightning. I looked in another direction, the sky was completely blue, not a cloud in the sky. In other places there were clouds, there were different conditions all around me. There was infinite space, but there was no space. There was no space at all. It was just distance. And so space is something that architects care a lot about. There is a great deal in the architecture of the last century that ignored space. Architects were very consumed with creating beautiful buildings. They would go up into the sky and say, look how beautiful I am. And there would be another one next to it, completely ignoring this one, saying, no, look how beautiful I am. And they were all competing with one another for attention, for, let's say, adulation, but they were all destroying the city. The space between the buildings was of no concern. And that's where the people are. That's where the city is experienced. I was in Denver on the same trip, and the whole central city is destroyed by these monstrous 40, 50, 60-foot tall buildings with no space for people. Buildings create space. The spaces that we find in Yerevan are much more human scale. There's life on the street, there's activity on the street, the building's open to the street. When you have a building that's close to the street, even a glass building, in fact, glass is one of the hardest surfaces you can imagine. It just closes you off from the inside, from the outside. So that, that's one thing that both architectural theory, at least recent architectural theory, and performance have not paid enough attention to. How buildings make space, how buildings make space for people. Without the buildings, there's infinite space. With the buildings, you can shape the space and make it urban space.
So, you have an interdisciplinary introduction to our concept of what constitutes elements that constitute an urban space. And this is a definition on which Dick and myself have been working for nearly 20 years now, and it's changing a little bit, adding elements. So maybe we start with the last word, spaces of opportunity and possibility. This is what I just discussed with our friend Ruben, which is when we speak about town, we speak of a space of possibility, and I link it in the philosophical context with Ernst Bloch and his book Principle of Hope. I had one discussion in one of these nights also with one of the participants in one of the evenings, and we were making fun because he was unable to say Ernst. He always said Ernest Bloch, and I was unable, of course, to pronounce any word at all in Armenian. So we had a very serious basis for discussion with Ernst Bloch, who is, let's say, one of the rare, more leftish thinkers in the German tradition. He died several years ago. But his scholar, Burkhard Schmidt, is my reference point, let's say, when I seem to be too blue-eyed and too optimistic, and I think things are doable, and this is somehow also the characteristics for the Spaces group, maybe. We think that transformational art, transformational work, transformational whatnot is possible. And that, of course, also in social science, we are more used to criticize instead of creating spaces. So this, I'm grateful to these two philosophical thinkers also to develop the idea of spaces, to relate it to town as a space of opportunity and possibility. Of course, you can see the whole globe as a space of possibility, but it's a bit too big to manage for me. So we speak about towns and even smaller entities. So from the space of opportunity, when we go to the start of our definition, sustainability is local. And local, as many other words, cannot be defined scientifically. What is local? We can enter an indefinite discussion about what local is. And local can be different things, depending on what process you have in mind. Local can be the neighborhood. This is what you try to do in COM. So it's a local process that this group of people tries to initiate. Local can be the whole town. Local can, if you look at it from a global perspective, local can even be our Spaces project, from Ukraine to Moldova to where are we in Armenia and to Georgia. So in a global term, this is also local. So it's really process linked. What kind of process are we speaking about? But the link to some entity is always necessary in sustainability. Of course, you can make theories in general, but as we speak about processes, and our definition is about sustainability being a balance-seeking process, so that process needs also a place where this balance-seeking process can happen. It is informed. There's space, on the one hand, for experts, for the scientists, for the researchers, and so on. It's informed in terms of activists who need to know a lot about the situation in which they are acting. So information is certainly also a key point here, or in policy making, or in whatever we do in the Spaces project. To be informed is the socle on which you stand, like Mother of Amelia, who stands on a very solid basement, and information is a solid basement that we need to have if we want to act. And it is participatory. That is also not. You can also not find a definition for participation. Who is participating? Who do you think you cannot include in your participation process? The discussion about nationalistic, anarchistic, and so on flags in demonstrations here. Who can be part of the participation of the participating groups when you develop, let's say, a vision for the town? Who is in and who is out? So participation is also about this question. Who is the insider? Who is the outsider? How many outsiders can you make into insiders? How can you create a process that is an inclusive process that attracts others, not just a small group that you are at the beginning, maybe 3 people, 4 people, this is how things happen, but then the process needs other people to join in, and who it is that does join in is a decision that you need to take nearly at every step. Who is the one with whom you can also create complicities, especially in an environment where the political consequences are not foreseeable, so you certainly carefully look out for who are partners in this process. And it's also balance seeking. What is a balanced process among groups of societal groups, let's say? Where is a balance? And is it always, it's never in balance, but somehow you think of a balance, also in terms of Anspruch. It's not, the balance is not there, but you are looking out for it, you're moving towards a balance without reaching it. And we just made I would like to also speak about the study of process. I think in these discussions here we always agreed about what we do being a process. Starting one, we maybe in midterm. We don't know where we are in this process, but it is a process and we share it. But in Vienna, when we did now something about sustainable city, I had natural scientists joining. And although this definition has also found its way into the Aalborg Charter about sustainable cities of towns, which was signed by 800 mayors 20 years ago, and now it's probably thousands, I don't know. But Dick was fighting nights and nights to get this process idea in the Aalborg Charter. But they were saying, no, it's not a process, it's a status, and we can define it and we can measure it. So there was a big debate even just of the word process, which is a sociological or social part, a way of looking into something. So even this one single word process can lead to big debates. But for the sustainable area budget, I give the floor to Dick, because that's his hobby and his
as we've seen in recent history, in Europe and particularly in the United States, the system under which we're operating, the economic system, is a system that drives us further and further from balance. And we're seeing the start of calamities based on a system in which the difference between the very wealthy and the poor is continually increasing, where the planet, the environment, is loaded more and more with toxic substances, where and you all know the kinds of things that you see in the news about catastrophes that are happening, global warming, that are altogether new to the planet and are the cause of what we do. It's not because we're bad people, it's because we're human beings, and each one of us is pursuing our own self-interest. We want to be more secure, we want to be more comfortable, we want to be more wealthy, we want to rise to positions that we think we have more control over our lives. And the history, and that seems to be a process that ultimately has to be destructive. And the reason that it hasn't been destructive is that we've lived in towns and cities And so the struggle of civilization has been the struggle of how to live in towns and cities, how to manage towns and cities in such a way that they can endure into the future. Now, many towns and cities and states, countries have failed, even through ecological catastrophes. One of the major reasons Rome failed was because they exploited northern Africa, and their breadbasket collapsed because of poor farming practices. But there's always been the balance of living together versus trying to maximize our own self-interest. And we're seeing recently that global capitalism, the very clever people, and the neoclassical economic theory under which we're operating has made openings for people and corporations and banks and investment brokers to find ways to put money in their own pockets at the expense of everyone else. And so this can't continue, or if it does, the big countries like the United States will no doubt collapse. I think if that happens, Armenia will be in better shape than a lot better shape than we are. But so the question of balance seeking and never really finding, because they're always imbalancing forces, has to become, an essential part of the way in which we operate. And that happens by turning it into a design process. And that's where the sustainable area budget comes in, operating within the sustainable area budget. I'll say a little bit more about that in a moment, but you all are, most of you are familiar with the ecological footprint idea, the fact that you're just being here and living on the planet consumes resources and creates waste, and that can only be balanced by nature. Nature has a certain capacity to rebalance the negative things that we dump into it. But that capacity is limited, and we've exceeded that capacity. So the negative aspects that we're building up in nature will come back as a time bomb to create problems, and it already has. So we have this one phrase, exporting no harmful imbalances beyond its territory or into the future. The idea here is a town or a city operating within a certain design budget, and I'll come to that in a moment. The test of how well we're operating is if we are not exporting problems beyond our territory in poorer countries or into the landscape or into the atmosphere or into the future, which has no way of, the future has no way of protecting itself from things that we do. One famous Wall Street speculator said, "Why should I worry about the future? What has the future ever done for me?" The ecological footprint is a very useful tool because you can go to the internet and find all sorts of ways to calculate how much your lifestyle, how much land would be necessary to support your lifestyle. The worst case is Americans. If everyone on the planet lived the lifestyle of an American, we would need 4 planets. Of course, we only have one, and that's the only one we'll ever have. And we're now engaged in a global experiment to see how far we can push that one planet. But we only get to try this experiment once. And if we fail, we're in very serious trouble. So we should operate with another principle, which is to be careful, to make sure that whatever we do doesn't exceed the carrying capacity of the Earth, and that means cutting back on what we do. So the ecological footprint tells us we need to reduce what we're doing many, many times. Now, no politician can run on a platform of, you have to use a quarter the amount of energy. This was popular in Germany 20 years ago. They had a theory, factor 4. If Germany, which is not known as an inefficient country, were to improve its resource efficiency 4 times, then Germany would be sustainable, was the theory. Later on, they did more careful calculations, and they decided it really wasn't 4, it was 10. Now that's only fuel for depression. How could we possibly do that? Well, I turn to you architects and you artists and you people who are interested in creative solutions and say, we need to turn it into a design problem. What is the design problem? Well, we know by the ecological footprint method, which has been adopted by a number of countries now in a number of cities, we know how much land we're entitled to provide. I mean, we're like a farmer out in the country. We have so many hectares of land, and that is all we have to provide to support our way of life. We can trade it for other things, for clothes and other things, but that's what we have. That's the source of our income. That's the source to balance out what we need. And so we know how much land that is. If we're a town of 1,000 people, 5,000 people, 10,000 people, a city of 1 million people, we're not ready to handle Yerevan yet. That's too complex for our simple minds. But we think we can begin to think about smaller towns to seek this balance for a small population. A town that has enough services, enough life opportunities, enough facilities, so that our children can imagine that they could live their lives there and be happy. The kind of town where they don't feel they have to go to a big city in order to live out a worthwhile life. I don't know exactly what that number is. It's probably not, with modern transportation and communication, it's probably not a huge number. So that's not something we'll debate. But if we can aggregate the land that each one of us is entitled to simply because we're alive, then we can say this is our budget, this is our architectural program, this is what we have to work with. We can do anything that we want with this land, this, let's call it biologically productive land, to support our way of life. And then it's really just a question of how creative we can be on the one hand, and how clever we can be to create a negotiation process that each one of us can try different things. Each one of us can contribute our creativity to coming up with an ongoing plan to create a town, its infrastructure, its occupations, its workplaces, its industries, its agriculture, its energy, its water, to support all of us together. So this is our agenda. We look at it as a systems modeling process. Today we have all kinds of great ways of making models, either abstract models and even through BIM, which is the way that more and more architectural projects are delivered, building information modeling, where instead of making beautiful drawings the way we used to, we put the building as a physical object in the computer, and we know every doorknob and every bolt and every hinge and every window that goes into that building. Not only do we know that, but we know how many bricks are in the wall. We know that if we replace part of this wall with a window, how much energy use, how much more energy use or less energy use the building consumes, because it's an intelligent program. If we can use this kind of modeling system at the scale of our city of 5,000 people, we can ask what-if questions about it. And so we're not chained with, in the old days, when I was younger, we couldn't allow very many people to interfere with our design process. It just confuses things. We couldn't afford to devote so much time to exploring all of the different possibilities. No client would pay us to explore all of the possible positive things that could happen with a building. Today we can. Today, once we have that building as an object that consumes energy, consumes water, produces waste, once we put that in the system, we can ask little questions. What if we process the sewage right on the site and create energy from it? What if we recycle all of the water? What if we make each building a net producer of energy instead of a consumer of energy? These are things we do today. These are things that we can do. We haven't done it very often. But I've just finished 5 houses for low-income people that produce more energy than they consume. So it's possible. And we can go well beyond that to the scale of cities, where not every building has to produce a surplus as long as the whole city region produces a surplus. So we not only have the town, we have it surrounded by its sustainable area budget, its agricultural area, its recreational area, its natural landscape, its nature, that we can study the balances. How much food do we have to produce on this land to support our population? Well, let's produce a little more so we can sell it to other places and import our computers, because we can't produce everything ourselves. So we have to create surpluses so that we can import. In fact, every town and city hundreds of years ago used to operate this way. They had no choice. Now, these towns and cities would not meet any sort of modern standard or any sort of modern social standard. So we might call these cities proto-sustainable, because in a material sense, every town that existed had to produce all of its needs from its local surrounding area, with the minor variation that maybe some silk came from China, or some salt came from the ocean, or a few other very high expense items came from elsewhere. So we produced, let's say, 98% of what we needed. So this is the sustainable area budget idea that looks at each city as being, on balance, self-sufficient. And on balance, not exporting, on a net basis, problems beyond its territory.
I don't know how long should we go on?
We've gone on a long time. I have a bunch of slides of projects of sustainable city propositions that over some years we've studied in Vienna, in China, and in Korea, in architectural competitions, and in projects that we like to think almost happened.
Maybe we could just show the first project a little bit that we worked for Vienna, which was the idea of building over a railway, binding the town together, and coming up. Yeah, maybe we go directly to this one.
Well, let me just quickly say that part of our inspiration are historic towns around the world, particularly in Europe, and for me personally, particularly Italian medieval hill towns. Here's San Gimignano, one of my favorite towns. This is a village in China where they're very dense, but they're each one of them surrounded by their supply area. Here is a diagram of one of our early studies for a sustainable city. The idea occurred that these historic cities are very badly suited to become modern towns, because there's no place for factories or warehouses or cinemas or large-scale anything. They're at the top of a hill, they're inaccessible, there's no place to park cars, there's no place for infrastructure. And it occurred that what happens if instead of building a city on a hill, you build it as a hill, with the interior of the hill having all of these major things that in fact are negative influences on the city. They're big, there's no one on the street, they feel unsafe. You put those inside where they don't have any walls or roofs, and on what would be the roof, you make the equivalent of a pedestrian hill town without any vehicles. Well, here's an early model built by some of my students of such a town. One of the characteristics is that it's built like that section, except that it has gently sloping streets from one end to the other, so that by the time one of those diagonal streets goes from the bottom to the top, it's risen 10 stories in the air. And it's past every one of the floors on the way. So that you have access to the inner hill, to all of these facilities inside the hill. You can even go through the hill to the other side. But the top is reserved for piazzas, for squares, for public space of all different sizes, and for public functions and everyday facilities, grocery stores, pharmacies. Here's a view looking down the main street, which is level from one end to the other. This is supported by an unusual structure, a concrete space frame that we developed. It's very light and efficient and has all the services running through it. Here's the space frame. It has large spans. I won't go through this, these descriptions, but one can imagine all sorts of advantages in not having to deal with the automobile or not having to deal with mechanized transportation. There's so much more space available for people and for small-scale buildings. So even though the buildings themselves above the new surface, I'm not having trouble with advancing it.
So you need centralized money and power to build such cities.
Excuse me?
You need centralized money and power to build such multi-story buildings.
Well, you might think that, but there are places in the world like China that are building dozens of new cities of as much as 1 million people.
China is exactly centralized.
Yes.
Yes. So you need China to build it.
Well, I noticed, I walked down the street called North Avenue. I don't know very much about that story, but there are opportunities, particularly if they evolve in a participatory way, where you attract people to the process. The process that we conceive is what we call a multiple alternative scenario building process. That means that a number of designs are going forward at the same time, and they're in competition with each other. And then each one of them represents different combinations of self-interest and institutional interest. So if you want to build a steel mill in this new town that we're considering, you want to get people in each of these models, or as many of these scenarios as possible, to embrace your idea of the steel mill. Now, no one wants you in the first place, because steel mills create a lot of noise, a lot of pollution. They're not very good to their employees. They take a lot of space. But you're willing to play the game. You know that you're not going to be in this town unless you can find ways to satisfy the other people in the town, the other stakeholders, that you're a big benefit to the town. And you do that by saying, okay, well, no fossil fuels in my steel mill. I'm going to generate all of the energy from renewable sources. And there are all sorts of ways to do that we know about. And I can afford it because I produce a product that gets a lot of export income. And then, and you embed yourself in several of these scenarios. But, and you also have a lot of waste heat that you have to get rid of. And this waste heat is then used for other industrial processes that you can sell to other consumers, and you keep cascading this waste heat down at lower and lower temperatures until you don't need solar energy at all, because you can heat the whole town with district heating from the waste heat that your steel mill generates. And so your model becomes very excited to all of these other players who couldn't figure out. You're also generating electricity from this waste heat, by the way. So you become very popular. Before, no one liked you at all. They didn't want you to get into the process at all. And now you become a big hero. But at one moment you look at what's happening and you see, well, this town isn't big enough to support my industry. There's not enough space for me inside the hill. Or you're competing with other interests for the space inside the hill. And the fit is not good. The balance that you're trying to seek is not good. So you say, okay, I'll do it the next time when you have to figure out how to do this, and we'll do a bigger one. But all of a sudden, there's no source of energy. There's no source of heat in this town. And everyone misses you. They're sorry they were so angry with you in the beginning. And now you have to look for another source of heat or an energy that might be more attractive. Maybe you're recycling aluminum, or maybe you're doing something else. But anyway, you keep playing this almost as a game, because every time you experiment with a different scenario, that is in the computer, that is in the systems model. So you end up with many, many different systems models. The more you play it, the more intelligent the whole process becomes, because you generate more and more alternatives. And at one point, it becomes so attractive.
Yeah, if you are alone and there is no politics and no it is exactly what China is about.
You must have heard
Not for long anymore.
Well, what I can tell you is that there are quite a few, let's call them experiments, but new towns in the United Arab Emirates. There's a town called Masdar, which tried to do this, but they pulled back. It will still be materially sustainable, but it will cost a lot of money, and it won't have any participation, and it will be top-down. We think that there's not enough intelligence embodied in that town, or in a number of towns that are trying to do similar things in China. And India, we had a very close call before the economic collapse. We were working with a communications billionaire who had gotten 6 different sites in India who wanted to build sustainable cities for different reasons. He wanted to build 6 sustainable cities in India. The first one was going to be 250,000 people. I don't know if we could. I don't think we could have handled that, but we could have done a small part of that. His idea was, well, in India we have to build sustainable cities. That's why I want to do it, because we can't rely on the central government to provide us with water, with waste treatment, with transportation, with energy. If we're going to build a town, we have to provide those things ourselves, and that was his attraction to the proposition that I'm telling you about.
I'm sorry, I have a question.
Yes.
And maybe there's an example of the model of the sustainable city as you imagine it in a less totalitarian geopolitical areas that you have already mentioned, because this is something that is really kind of problematic. Like I mean, China, India, Arab Emirates, really these are the places where power and money go one in hand, and they really can do experiments, and maybe democratic cities also have something to say
I
about
don't know
this.
how democratic a city we can find. let me propose Vienna. Is that, I don't know if that's good enough for your objection. Back in 1994, the vice, through Heidi's work, the vice mayor of Vienna, who was Hannes Svoboda, who was also the director of urban development, right after this Aalborg conference, where I had given the keynote address on sustainable cities. The Aalborg conference was Europe's response to the Earth's Charter of 1992 in Rio. So the European Union held their own conference to localize the Rio Charter, Local Agenda 21, to the European situation. And one of the main purposes of the conference was to write a European charter of cities and towns towards sustainability. And we wrote the first third of that, and coming right off of that, we went to Vienna, met with the vice mayor, we introduced the question of sustainability and how you do it, and he gave us this site, the Westbahnhof site, which is, well, he gave it to us to study. He said, how would you like to work on this site? He said that we've had many studies of this site, and none of them was economical, none of them was enough of an urbanistic contribution. Maybe you can do it. I think he had his doubts, but he thought it was worth the risk. And anyway, we did 3 different studies on the site over a period of 4 or 5 years. It's a train station with a train yard behind it. It's very near the center of Vienna. It makes a wound in the city because it slices the city in half. And so we proposed building over this site. We had to maintain the train yard below it. And so, and this is the site in Vienna. This is the central city. This is the Ringstrasse, and this is the Gürtel, the outer ring. And this is the train station right here, and here's the train yard. This is the summer palace of the emperors, and there are parks in here. But between the summer palace and the city, there's not a good way to get to it. Between this part of the 15th district and this part, there's not a good way to cross those tracks. So it represents, and it also let's say, the most deteriorated part of the city. So it represents a real problem for the city, an ongoing problem. And this is our final study of the plan of our final study. It has, this is the train station, this is the main boulevard, the Gürtel. Right here, there are about 7 streetcar lines, trolley lines that meet at a station here. Many train lines come in from Europe, as well as local lines. And there are 2 train lines, subway lines, underground lines, that cross right here. So it's a major port of entry, a major transportation hub in the city. So we proposed, and this is rather different from the previous one I showed you. This is very long and very narrow. We proposed building over the city with a street that started out right here by the trolley terminal, by the streetcar terminal, and rose at a gentle slope of 6%. And every 3 floors there was a piazza. At level 4, at level 7, level 10. This is 10 floors above here. That's 1,800 meters from here to here. And this is the main square in the city. And then it goes back down again to level 7, level 4, and then out to here. We ran a trolley, a streetcar, all the way through, so we make it completely accessible. And it passes all of the levels. It has a courtyard type of development, as well as a stepping development, that is a terrace development, going down sideways to, in addition, making bridges between courtyards in the existing urban fabric. So it's a bridging, it's a bridging development where we're knitting the two sides together with completely pedestrian access, and we're providing, and there are no vehicles here except a streetcar, although this street is designed so that emergency vehicles or delivery vehicles could use it. There are no stairs in it. And I'll show just a few more slides. Here is that sloped street passing several different levels. It cuts through on an angle because the hill is going up this way. So in order to go up the hill, it has to turn slightly from the angle that the hill is stepping up. Here's not such a good photograph of the model. This model is of the second design. It's a little bit different. It had water towers and windmills. That's what those small buildings are. And it bridged over the train platforms with glass that had photovoltaic cells in it, so there was a lot of electricity generated. Not enough. But one of the problems with this implantation, it doesn't have any earth in it. And it's completely surrounded by the city. There's no nature here at all. And so we came up with a partner land concept. We took the sustainable area budget that the several thousand people that would live here would be entitled to, and we went to a rural area, 30 kilometers north of Vienna, and we partnered with the city through the interest of the mayor and the local farmers to make a partnership between the rural area and the urban area, so that on a net basis, both of them together would have all of their own energy, all of their own food, and lots of services going between the two. I'll go through the rest of these slides quickly. This is where I live in Kentucky. You have your molybdenum mines. We have coal. We have mountaintop removal. We completely destroy the landscape and make it look worse than the moon. And coal is associated with the liberation of all sorts of toxic chemicals into the environment. This is how we do it. We make these high walls. We blast them away. We dump the overburden into the valleys, and we expose the seams of coal, and then we scrape the coal off and drill into the seams horizontally. We took an area like this that was a real wound in the earth that overlooked a small city in Kentucky, and this is the original condition. Here's the coal seam, and here's the mountain. So what they did in the mining was they removed all of this rock, they dumped it into the valley, which is unstable, so there are periodically floods that flood out whole towns and wipe away houses. But even when there isn't flood, there are all kinds of toxic minerals that now have water running through it, and it poisons people's wells, it poisons the rivers and streams. They scrape off all of this coal in the seam here, and then they drill into the seam to get the rest of the coal out. So we propose building against this high wall here, building a new town that has an interior that has all of the functions, all of the infrastructure, all of the large-scale buildings that a modern city has, and on the surface make small-scale residential. And this is what our proposal looked like. It has the same gently sloping streets going up, turning around in a square, going back up, turning around, going back up, weaving back and forth up the town. It also has an elevator here, or a funicular, that will take you directly up. And there are periodically elevators inside the town, too, to take you to the different levels. And here are some sketches of level streets and slope streets, and here is the intersection. Excuse me?
Who is paying for this?
Good question.
Who is paying?
Well, I came to Armenia to try to drum up some support for our economy is very bad, and we thought that if you could afford to build North Avenue, then certainly you could.
We did the codex. It is not Armenian one.
Oh, you'll have to tell me later where did the money come from.
We see several countries are participating to make one movie, European movies. It's not one country movie. Then they make this Cephalopazatron, yes, and they build Collider, suppose. And all countries are participating in such projects. I'm interested in America. Is there a corporation who is taking care of this, or the state, or who?
Well, what I can tell you is that the city of Vienna was serious for a few years anyway.
When the city is paying?
No.
Who?
Well, I'm not even sure. I mean, the city would certainly pay, but probably their contribution, and also the railroad, because it's on railroad land. So probably they would work out some kind of deal where investors coming in would have access to the land, and both the city, I'm sure the city would have to invest to some extent in it. But I'm an architect, I don't know anything about money, as you can imagine.
Budget, that's what, sustainability, budget, locality. So it's not about locality anymore.
No, it is.
No, it's not. If they are gathering money, if you are searching money all over the world, then it's not local.
Well, what I can say is that for hundreds of years, there's been such a thing as you say, as investment. And again, that's not something I've ever made any money with. But cities get built, buildings get built, and big.
You don't like that?
No, I don't. That's why I'm interested in sustainable cities.
I think the question is whether or not your project includes cost-benefit analysis. In other words, you produce fantastic ideas, very interesting building spaces, but you're saying that you're not a money man, and you don't know what it will cost, and you don't know where the money is coming. I think that's the question he's asking. To a practical planner, what you have to do, you have to go A to Z. You start with the idea, in your case, sustainability, objective, value, and you develop the project until you come to a point where you have a chart of a basic profit and loss analysis, which makes sense and which will attract capital. If you don't do that, then it's...
What I can tell you is that the third commission we got, we had two commissions from the city of Vienna, from the Division of Urban Development. The third project we did was not commissioned by the city. It was commissioned by the National Bank of Austria. And it produced a document this thick that looked at a number of different ways of looking at the economics. One was the most conventional way, which you're talking about. If you look at the current market, what is this valuable piece of real estate worth in the middle of Vienna for, let's say, conventional development? And that proved to be beneficial. But what proved to be much more beneficial is if you look at other issues that conventional real estate never satisfies. What is survival worth? I mean, that was the last one, and that we could only speculate on. What is it worth to have a model in Vienna that can endure indefinitely because it doesn't pollute, it doesn't consume fossil fuels or non-renewable resources. That you can't measure. But you're right, you have to make the present-day cost-benefit analysis economic model.
So the problem, I think, is you have a community, you have a society,
yes,
who has certain interests, such as preservation of the environment,
yes,
providing low-cost housing, and this and the other. So that society, the leadership of the society, has got a budget, which is generated by income. And there is also the capitalist, so much money, who has to be interested in putting up the money or part of the money to make money. Well, unless you plan for this combination, conceptually you are doing it, but financially.
Let me say something else which you're probably aware of, that Austria, Vienna, has a number of programs. Vienna has its fingers in all real estate development in the city, which in one way or another it supports through all sorts of different financial vehicles. So if the city is interested and they want to make this work and they want to make this real estate available for all sorts of, again, remember I told you that this is not housing, this is not industry, this is not parking, it's everything you need in town. And Vienna is also growing. But it's growing because it's sufficiently large and has to grow away from the city. And the further it gets away from the city, the more problems are created. So if it has this large area within the city, this is worth a lot of money. A lot of people will be coming to this. I don't want to make the case of developing it, but this was in our economic model. And so, well, Vienna is growing, and it needs all of the things that would be on this site. And this is a much better way to do it, both in terms of quality of life, in terms of the way you live in this place, in terms of, I mean, this is a prime site because from here you can get anywhere in the city very quickly. It's the best site in the city because of all of the public transportation. So it's absolutely prime real estate that will never exist anywhere else in Vienna. Again, if you can figure out a way to make it work, and no one before had figured out a way to make it work. And I'm not sure that we did either, even in conventional terms, but our analysis, which was accepted by the Bank of Austria, showed that even in the current economic cost-benefit analysis, it made sense. So,
I think that's the question.
Well, that's one question, but you know, I wouldn't develop it just if it made economic sense in a conventional cost-benefit analysis.
Unless you make economic sense, it's not going to happen. No?
Yes, you're right. You're right. Well, it's not going to happen, but that wasn't the reason.
But I wish it would. I mean, you do too.
What?
You wish it would happen.
Yes, I wish it would happen.
Therefore, we should work.
Yes, I would be able to make a living as an architect.
Seems like it's already getting into question and answer. Let's see if there's anyone else who has a question. Because unfortunately we can't use this hall any longer. Like for 5 or 10 more minutes. If there's anyone that has more questions for Mr. Levine and Heidi, they can ask, and then we can...
We should go.
Yes, and opportunity.
Yes.
I think it is the reason or something, because space is easy.
Yes.
It is senseless to say space for possibilities and opportunities. Space is something that has to do with possibilities and opportunities. First of all. Second, about aestheticism of your perception of space. You say that buildings shape the space, they frame the space, and space is formless. I imagine myself to be in a jungle. Is it a space? Never. Because I can't make a footstep without any danger, because every mosquito will bite me. Or the same in the rock. It is all I have to carve it. So building is not put, as Heidegger would say, not in the space. It is making space. So space is formless, it's nonsensical. Again, the perception of space, the continuity of space we are talking about, is very much aesthetical. When I enter internet or something, space is not continuous. People have communication very well without continuous. The only thing is sexuality, that we need physical space to be unknown figures walking and having accidental encounters.
And you can do that in the dark.
No, you can't, because I may not like you. If I like you, I must see you for liking you.
If you don't see me, maybe you'll like me better.
That's why I'm switching. Then it is not sexual. Then it is mental. It is internet.
I don't know what your needs are, so.
Just to make this conversation not a monologue but a dialogue, that's all.
Yeah.
Well,
no, but I mean, we think of space of possibilities not also in terms of physical space. There's also space in the mind, of course, we will have also space of possibility to make visions and to invent things even in the mind. So the space of possibility is also a space where we can come up with new ideas or with social communication or whatever. So there's one concept of space which is physically more.
I think Mr. was also speaking from the philosophical or...
Yeah, from a philosophical
point of view.
yes, sure.
And he wasn't really speaking only about space where buildings are. Or,
so my question would be, are architects making spaces from places or places from spaces? Because if your base is locality, and I don't think it works because of this integration of all over globalism and whatever, it is not anymore anything local. Locus means that some accustomed way of life. Locus is this. When I know where if I stretch my hand, it will be the shoulder of my friend. Yes. This is locus. The space is exactly the opposite. I am free to, there is a freedom to stretch my hand, but I don't know what will happen. So what are architects doing?
We're in Europe, we're not in the jungle. So we know when you stretch your hand, the tiger won't bite you. But no,
where?
In Yerevan.
Oh, come on.
So far I've been lucky, I suppose. But no, I like what you're saying, but I would say that the space that I talk about is architectural space.
Exactly.
And there are other spaces, there's conceptual space, but buildings make what I'm saying is architectural space, and without the buildings, buildings define and enclose space, and this is the space where things happen. And I find a lot of that kind of space in Yerevan. As I understand it, in previous times, in the Soviet era, people were not so welcome to, the spaces were their space, not our space, so to speak. And today I see that people are learning how to use space more and more, or being accustomed to being in public space and to doing things in public space. And that's very good. But I'm also saying that when an architect gets a commission to design a building, he or she may only have a facade on a street. And there isn't a huge opportunity for changing or making space with that limitation. And so,
which model of architecture design is that? I mean, possibility to work on the facade and then not touch upon the space and the infrastructure.
It happens.
Yeah, it happens, but
so you call it architecture and the other part sustainable architecture? Because during the centuries, architecture was what we try to define as sustainable. Architecture was always like that. If there are mistakes and stupid things, you can call it bad architecture.
But it's still architecture, yes.
Yeah, I mean, the word, by the way, do you know when this word came on the scene, this sustainable word? Who made it? Who introduced
Yes,
it?
but that's a discussion I never lead because that leads into endless discussions. There is an Austrian reason, Nachhaltig, which was forestry, and then it's in the 90s and 80s that sustainability became the discussion again. And then we spent hours at meetings just asking what sustainability means, and in German there's no word for it and so on. So this is really going into a direction where we do not discuss the content anymore, but the linguistics, and I'm a linguist. So in a way I like it, but I mean, that's not the point. You can go on and on and on. Yeah. There are texts in the Austrian forest law, for instance, which use the term sustainable, but that was in the middle of the last century. So it has a new meaning now. So etymologically you can trace it back, but now is a new time to define what it is.
Yeah, like Arab Spring for me. Like Arab Spring. Yeah, very interesting concept again. Why it is spring?
Well, I guess we're moving very far away from our
Okay, that's sorry,